Okay, welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a nice lunch and welcome back to our online audience. So this is our last few sessions of this year's forum. So I hope many of us are joining us online, and I'd like to welcome the next set of panelists who will take about an hour to discuss what responsible recruitment looks like on the ground. So let's welcome them. And if everybody could take a seat so we can get started. Thank you.
Yeah, I can see. Start. Should we give it a minute or start? Okay, all right. Thanks, everyone. Ideally, we should have an energizer after the excellent lunch. But do what you have to do mentally and be energized. This is going to be an interesting panel where we are talking about what responsible recruitment should look like on the ground. Yeah, thanks. We have William connecting with us online. We have Taisuke, Beam, and Quentin. So I'm just going to start off with the first round of questions. Get through it quickly so we have time for Q&A. Could we close the door? Yeah. So we have with us Taisuke Komatsu. I hope you got your name right. And who's with the regional office for Southeast Asia with OHCHR. They've been doing some very, very interesting reports in the region around recruitment. And one of the recent reports is, of course, on the scam centers. So you uncovered the extensive criminal operations set up to perpetrate cyber-enabled fraud in your recent report, centering on the lived experiences of victims who were subjected to human rights abuse. Can you share a bit more of the findings of the report? What are the actions the state must take to protect them? And if you have any suggestions for business, yes, but we can talk about the states to begin with.
Thank you, Vani. And my apologies that I was a bit late. Yes, I'm sorry about that. So yes, I'm gonna just move to my next slide. So February this year, we issued this report which we called it Wicked Problem. And I would just like to share some findings related to labor migration from this report that we identified in terms of the link between scam trafficking and labor migration. So when we look at the labor migration recruitment, how labor migration recruitment happens within and from the Asia-Pacific region, especially for low-wage workers. As many of you know, it typically follows three pathways. So one is direct recruitment through online platforms or informal job sites. The second one is government employment services, which are meant to provide official channels. And the third one is private intermediaries, including licensed agencies, brokers, and informal social networks. But as many of you know well, these recruitment processes for labor migration are rarely straightforward. It is often complex, layered, and opaque. And for many aspiring migrant workers, navigating this system by themselves alone is nearly impossible. And as a result, they rely heavily on multiple intermediaries, agents, brokers, even acquaintances to access critical information such as travel, visa arrangement, as well as job opportunities. And this is where we see the nexus between the labor migration in and from the region and the trafficking into scam operations. So because of this dependence on intermediaries, workers can become highly vulnerable to deception, misled about the nature of the job, the conditions of work, and sometimes even the destination itself. And in fact, the private recruitment dominates labor migration in and from the region. And unfortunately, the regulatory frameworks often lack effective safeguards, oversight, and the enforcement. So what happens is, as a consequence, is recruitment practices can look strikingly similar. So it is making it extremely difficult for individuals to distinguish whether it is a legitimate job opportunity or a pathway into trafficking. And in some cases, we see even more troubling reality, which is private recruitment actors, not only informal brokers, but also licensed agencies have been complicit in trafficking individuals into scam operations. And I would like to share some findings from our report. So we did this research using the systems thinking and the behavior science methods. We interviewed survivors of trafficking from scam centers, and a critical factor that emerged from the evidence from our research is the trust. So we found that trust is often exploited and harvested by traffickers. And in the broader labor context of migration that I just spoke about, trust plays a central role because many migrant workers are already navigating uncertain, non-transparent, and risky processes. And the finding from our data, our research, the data from our research reinforces this point. So we found that nearly 75% of victims we interviewed reported being recruited through an action of trusted source. 37% were recruited directly by someone who they knew and trusted. And another 30% first heard about the opportunity through a trusted connection. And among those who answered that they knew, recruiters told us that 67% had a very high trust in the recruiters. And these recruiters include family members, former colleagues, childhood friends, and the acquaintances, as well as new connections they met through social media platforms or online. So our finding tells this critical insight that the trust is being weaponized by traffickers. And this also raises questions for all of us here today. Like, why do victims place greater trust in these informal networks? Does it mean a lack of trust in formal recruitment processes? And are public institutions being trusted or accessible for migrant workers? I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sasuke. We have Beam, co-founder of Shramik Sanjal, speaking next. And just building on what Taisuke said about how opaque and complex the recruitment system can be. I know your organization's been working on a comparative assessment on the Nepal-Malaysia corridor. Before we go into the findings of that, if you can just talk about the free visa, free ticket policy of Nepal. What does it look like on the ground? What is the engagement of recruitment agents? And do you think Nepal as a state has really met its obligations?
Sorry. Thanks, Bunny. Thank you, ISRB, for the invitation to the forum. So when we talk about the fair and ethical recruitment or free visa, free ticket policy of Nepal, Nepal has passed the free visa, free ticket policy in 2015, especially two corridor between Nepal and Malaysia and Nepal to GCC. That means Nepal should Nepal has that policy, and no worker should be paying for the recruitment fee. But the recruitment agencies can charge about 10,000 Nepali rupees as administrative cost or something like that. But the reality is totally different. What it has been mentioned in the policy is something, and what has been practiced on the ground is different. That means majority of Nepali migrant worker seeking for a foreign employment to whether be it in Malaysia or the GCC has to pay a very high recruitment fee. It's about 400,000 Nepali rupees, which is equivalent to about 2,000 US dollar at the current exchange rate. But that has been majorly practiced in Nepal by many recruitment agency, but there are few recruitment agency who come out from that space and really try to implement the fair and ethical and employee principle from their side, and there has been some implementation around that. And then I think we have a couple of colleagues from those fair and ethical recruitment practices into this room as well. They have been implementing the fair and ethical recruitment and practicing this. And then what I found from my engagement with those recruitment agency and being as a migrant worker, lived in Qatar for over 8 years and experiencing the worst case of forced labor and exploitation in Qatar, that I myself can reflect that when I was going for Qatar, I also paid the high recruitment fee. And in 2013, and coming to that, time and place, and having those recruitment agency literally practicing the fair and ethical recruitment kind of gives me a bit of hope that there is slow, but there is a very, progress onto that. And through my engagement and also experience that the fair and ethical recruitment, the term or the topic has been heavily concentrated into the recruitment fee. That is true. For sure, the worker shouldn't be paying for the job. And it has, we have to definitely talk about there shouldn't be the fee. But there are other areas and elements that we need to also talk about, like access to information, and fair hiring process, and the grievance mechanism, and the working condition and living condition of the migrant worker, and the wages protection system in the country of destination. And those are the element is a bit of like in shadow in fair and ethical recruitment model, but that is also need to be addressed and talk about. And in addition to that, the Nepal government has also put in place some regulatory framework and some mandatory kind of processes to go through by the aspiring migrant worker or the migrant worker who are going to deploy in country of destinations. And that is the pre-departure orientation that Nepal government has mandated, a mandatory pre-departure orientation for all migrant worker to attend at least 12 hours of pre-departure orientation. And that basically covers a lot of information about the cultural differences, do's and don't, and many other aspects of the worker rights in country of destination. But those orientations are also not very effective in terms of Nepal. I mean, the migrant worker can go attend and there is no kind of evaluation and check and balance how effective that orientation program is going. And sometimes the migrant worker are just, enroll into the orientation program and they don't really have to go and then get the kind of information they're supposed to receive, and that is something happening. But in contrast to that, through our engagement, Shramik Sanjal, our organization, in one of our pillar, which is called empowerment, that we run a pre-departure orientation to the migrant worker, and we have delivered numerous pre-departure orientation to over like 3,000 plus migrant worker, and that is quite interesting for us. And then during the orientation program, we run a very simple kind of a survey to understand what is their level of like the information about the fair and ethical recruitment, and the money that they use while they come to country of destination and on and send back home, and their expectation while being in Nepal in terms of living condition, in terms of working condition in country of destinations. And interestingly, the a majority of the migrant worker have responded that they have kind of mixed level of information about the fair and ethical recruitment model. Almost like half of them responded that they were aware about the fair and ethical model, while the 50% is almost 50% has they are not aware about. And
I think that would probably be a good segue into what Quentin is talking
Sure.
about, right? So we have, we see the recruitment corruption. We see even if governments have taken the right policies, it's not implemented.
Yeah.
So Quentin, with 58 and the work you do with businesses to ensure responsible recruitment, could you share a successful case study on what happens when companies seek to implement this in a way that drives positive outcome? Because a lot of what Beam says is also crossing over to company responsibility once the worker goes to the place of employment.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Vani, and thank you both. So 58, all of our work really is a mix of research and technology solutions that look at improving working conditions in the supply chain. And I wanted to talk today specifically about our platform, Just Good Work. So Just Good Work is a mobile tool that was designed to help make sure that workers know what is okay and what is not okay, their rights and their responsibilities from the earliest possible stage of recruitment all the way through their journey into work and when they would return home again. It started in 2019 in East Africa for workers who were going into the Gulf. But it's very special to be doing this forum in Malaysia because Malaysia was one of the first next countries where the app was adapted for during COVID, actually. So we make sure that the information is as accessible as it can be in text and in audio, and that it's accurate in terms of both what the law says, but also in terms of workers' actual stories, and that it's continually updated and informed by their experiences. Now, I wanted to share the specific case study of Evergreen. So they are a Malaysian furniture manufacturer, and their HR manager unfortunately couldn't be at the forum this week, but he asked me to share their story. The app generally is free for workers to access wherever it's available. But for companies like Evergreen, they can pay to include a work portal in the app. And what that means is they can include really any pre-departure or information about the company that they want. And in Evergreen's case, this meant some videos of their factory floor, of the accommodation, of information about what fees workers shouldn't be paying, and trying to make sure that that information was accurate, regardless of what recruiter was being used in their recruitment from Nepal. So they worked very closely with their Malaysian recruiter to roll this out, so that any worker, as soon as they access a job ad, they would download the app through the QR code or the link. And this is in their home country. So what it meant for the factory is that when people arrived, they could see immediately that the factory looked like what they thought it was going to look like. What they said to the HR manager was very excited the first time he talked to us about it, because he said for the first time people could show friends and family what the workplace was going to look like that they were choosing to go to, and they could decide if that was the right thing for them or not. He said what it meant for us as HR, the HR team at the factory, is when people arrived, we didn't have to spend a lot of time unpicking misinformation or disinformation that had happened in recruitment, because the recruiter could say to those workers, if anything looks different to what you see in the factory, to what you see in the app, please come and tell us. But it also meant that straight away people were immediately into their work. And what he described as the reason why they did this and wanted to implement the application was prior to using the app, with every cohort they recruited, around 15 to 20% of that each cohort would immediately either want to return home or would want to move on to other work once they arrived in Malaysia, because things were so different to what they expected. And so I wanted to just show a little bit of what that meant then for the factory once this took place. And very practically, it was a significant reduction in initially that voluntary return rate, or voluntary kind of moving on rate. So from 14% down to 1%. And 2 years on, we just talked to them a couple of weeks ago. And for the first time, 100% of that same cohort that were recruited with those kind of aligned expectations of what they were coming to, 100% renewed their contracts and wanted to remain working for the factory. And they said that had never happened before. So very practically, what that had meant for them was they had saved the cost of recruiting each worker and the re-recruitment that had to happen with that initial turnover rate, but also the reduced recruitment of having everyone renew their contracts those 2 years on. It was about $850 was the cost of recruitment for each worker. So in their case, this saved them around $20,000. Now, with some of the costs of recruitment that we've heard the last couple of days, you can see that saving would be much, much greater even for some factories. So I just wanted to share this as a very practical example of how a factory is using this kind of connecting with workers very early in recruitment, aligning expectations in a way that is saving them money, and now they can make the case internally that they can pay for the cost of recruitment far more effectively because of these savings that they're making through improved HR outcomes, really. That reduced turnover, improved onboarding, and those things aren't even factored into the cost savings. And we'd like to look at how we can start to model that as this case study is developed. Thanks.
Thank you, Quentin. Hi, William. We miss you in the room. Thanks for joining us online. So we've spoken about state responsibility, recruitment reforms, business responsibility. From your vast network of partners, what are the gaps you see in access to justice, alternative dispute mechanisms, transnational justice, both by states and businesses?
Yeah, thanks, Wani. And I would have loved to be there, but for some reason, just couldn't get there. But let me, I think there's an echo, but are you all getting it? Can you hear me clearly?
We can hear you well.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So perfect. I think one of the biggest challenges in access to justice is, especially, and I appreciate this context of looking at recruitment fees and things like that, but when we within our network are looking, and we've seen access to justice in terms of workers not getting their wages. So this is one of the biggest issues and the most recurring issue throughout the workers' kind of work life, particularly in this temporary labor migration programs. When we started documenting something like in 2008, when we started documenting worker abuses, workers' wages or non-payment of wages, and in different forms, whether it is deductions, whether it is late payments, whether it is half payments, or whether it is no payments at all, whether it is end of service benefits not being given, all these kind of range of issues that are related to wages, we found non-payment of wages in a general way as the biggest issue that workers kind of complain against. And this is across the board, from domestic workers to even high-skilled workers sometimes. So this is something that we need to kind of look at. And I think this is the biggest challenge that we have. We've tried to raised this issue at different levels in terms of why access to justice then when workers complain. And I know there is a shift today in terms of online complaint mechanisms by many member states kind of thing. But there is the whole question of accessibility to these online systems. Companies have also put in some kind of a complaint mechanisms online, and companies have also tried different processes like you know you get confidence building among the workers to make a complaint, different processes like mailboxes, anonymous complaints, and such procedures have been put in by companies. But still, I think what we continue to receive, and of course this varies from company to company and the size of the company. Generally, as a general kind of issue, but we are seeing, of course, you cannot generalize so easily as well, particularly when we look at the context of Malaysia. But generally, it's big brands that seem to have some measures in place where wages are given on a timely manner, they are being monitored, and there is a system of complaint kind of thing. This is largely with big brands. But as you go lower down in the supply chain of big brands, and as you look at small and medium enterprises, and then as you come even lower into the informal sector like domestic work, that is where you begin to see a lot of the challenges in terms of access to justice and in terms of what complaints workers can make. Because it's not only about making complaints, it is not only about having access to making complaints, but it is also the how after making a complaint, what happens to the worker in terms of how the worker can be how the employer can move from making the worker undocumented, lose his job, or some kind of harm done by the recruiter in the country of origin, or threats to the family members of the worker in the country of origin. Now, these are some things that we have seen over time, kind of thing happening, and they continue to happen in terms of access to justice. We have, as MFA, called for and continue to call for in our wage theft campaign. We have called for transnational justice mechanisms, and that also only as a last resort, because whatever it is, we believe that justice should be available to the migrant in the country in which he or she is working. But because of the time period of the complaints and because the whole nature of the safety and safe space that the migrant needs to be in, and sometimes that is not possible in a destination country, we propose, or we are advocating for, a transnational justice mechanism where the worker can return home and then make a complaint when the worker is in a safe space. But we have a long way to go in member states agreeing to this in a bilateral agreement kind of thing. So this is where we are now at the moment in terms of continuing to advocate. We believe, and that's why I think COVID was an eye-opener in the sense of a lot of countries experimented with online justice mechanisms, remote hearings, and things like that. And this is a possibility that can be explored within labor migration corridor, where we could establish formal remote hearing procedures across corridors. Now, this is something still to be taken up by some member states, but there are member states that are willing to look at this. It was a conversation in the Abu Dhabi dialogue. It was a conversation that happened on the sidelines of the IMRF, but it is definitely a conversation that needs to happen more. Alternative dispute mechanisms is something that is growing now, but I would caution against alternative dispute mechanisms only unless they are very robust and transparent in some way, because the mediation processes generally follow a power dynamic in which the worker is left in a situation of take it or leave it. And that, I think, is challenging in that sense, kind of thing, because we've seen mediation, even when the state is involved in terms of countries of origin, you have the labor attaches being involved in mediation processes. And more dangerously, I think, when civil society is engaged as well, because when civil society is engaged, you get these non-disclosure agreements kind of thing, which then doesn't allow the transparency that even civil society needs to put forward or have in terms of what was agreed upon. And we have seen in recent cases, kind of thing, where it has not entirely worked in the favor of the worker or in favor of all the workers complaining. I'll leave it at that.
William, I'll come back to you with the first question for the second round while we have you here. It's interesting what you're saying about alternative dispute mechanisms, because that seems to be promoted by a lot of destination countries. And origin countries seem to be towing the line as well. So this brings us to the kind of corruption we see, not just in private recruitment agencies, but also state agencies. If you could speak a little bit more about this corruption.
Look, I think we have to recognize that corruption has become kind of almost the mainstay of temporary labor migration programs. And I'm saying this because from the recruitment process already, and have seen this and from Nepal to Bangladesh, India, even the Philippines kind of thing, within the whole system of the way temporary labor migration programs are governed from recruitment, there is already corruption kind of thing that happens at that space. It varies in different countries and in different ways, but it is something that is found in all countries. But in terms of alternative dispute mechanisms, kind of thing, I think this is a push is being made towards this. And at some stage, countries of origin and countries of the states involved are served together with the employers as a power base against the migrant workers, and largely because it is taken off kind of thing, where with countries of origin having no other option but to be able to look for and explore new markets. This has become an easy way out, particularly because also these recruitment agencies go under a kind of rating mechanism. And there is enough leeway within a rating mechanism and the country of origin is companies are not immediately blacklisted if something goes wrong or they have been doing some corrupt practice and things like. Countries of origin don't necessarily immediately blacklist those companies. They are given a second chance, a third chance, and things like that. And because also I think the way the countries of destination pressure countries of origin. I'll give you one example of this kind of thing. For example, now we are seeing where, at least in the past, in the Gulf, we had missions, country of origin missions, playing an active role in, let us say, mediation for their migrant workers when the migrant workers came to complain. Many of the mission labor attaches would call up the employer to be able to follow through on the complaint of the migrant worker. But now countries of origin have been told that is not their job. So and I was very recently actually with a labor attaché, just in fact last week, who said they have been called several times to say, you cannot intervene. If there is any issue, let it be taken up by the Ministry of Labor in the country of destination. So basically the pressure that is put on countries of origin to succumb to not being able to follow up, the labor attaché not to be able to follow up, but to forward it to the Ministry of Labor. And of course, that the Ministry of Labor has all the kind of pressures from the country of destination by the employers, by the company, and depending on who is in what space. And I'm talking particularly of certain regions in the world where there is a lot of there's a lot of pressure on the labor ministries itself by employers, by companies, kind of thing, when it comes to access to justice issues. And so sometimes when countries of origin are involved in trying to follow with the country of destination, this can take forever. And we are seeing this in these online systems as well as in the alternative processes that are being suggested. They take forever. They play out. They have time to play with, and they play out the permit of the period of the permit of the migrant worker till such time as the migrant worker either gives up, passes on power of attorney to the mission, or moves or is repatriated back to the country, and then that goes into a forever delay process. In a recent engagement with countries of mission, we did ask if any of them have been successful with the power of attorney process once the migrant worker has returned. They have come back saying to us that it's very rare that they are successful in these, and they still have cases that are pending 2-3 years kind of thing, and these are big companies. So I think there is a lot that plays out in this. Thank you.
Thanks, William. If you can, we are hoping to have a Q&A at the end of it. If you could stay on, please. And that was really interesting, linking the missions to this issue of recruitment as well. Taisuke, coming back to you, your office also did another report on the temporary labor migration, which is very similar to what William and Beam have covered in terms of the GCC. What recommendations do you have for states, including in the context of newer sectors of employment that are emerging, which are particularly exploited?
Yeah, thank you, Barney. If you can put my slide back, that would be great. I just have one slide to share the QR code of the report. But a few years ago, we issued a report called issued a report on temporary labor migration programs within and from the region, and we called it "We Wanted Workers, but Human Beings Came." And so temporary labor migration programs is the dominant form of labor migration in this region, which are often described as triple win solution for countries of destination, countries of origin, and the migrant workers. But we believe in reality, they create heavy bureaucratic hurdles, which make migrant workers vulnerable to human rights abuse and violations. And the structure of these programs are marked by temporary status, the restriction on human rights, unequal power dynamics, not only between employers or recruiters and workers, but as well as countries of origin and destination, as William described. And they place migrant workers in very precarious and often discriminatory conditions. And this isn't just inconvenience; it actually exposes to real risks, such as exploitation, trafficking, as I spoke earlier. So for us, the challenge is how to not only improving the procedures, but how we can rethink labor migration in this region more fundamentally. So we believe that in order to address exploitation in a more meaningful way, we need to go beyond fixing recruitment. We recommend to systemic policy change for labor migration so that it can be sustainable and rights respecting. And we need to move away from models that depend on enforced temporariness and the unequal treatment of migrant workers, and that is grounded in principles of fairness and dignity. And under international human rights law, we have this thing called the threshold of non-discrimination. So any policy or measures should be assessed against the proportionality, necessity, and legality. And if any of it doesn't pass this test, it is considered discriminatory, therefore should be removed. And it also states, and there are also very many promising practices around the world and also in the region. For example, Australia recently launched a pilot project on called Workplace Justice Visa. So like when migrant workers face labor exploitations or other abuses, they can switch to this visa to pursue justice while continue to work in Australia, because while they're pursuing justice, they still also need to work to survive. And there are some criticism or like shortcomings already identified by civil society in Australia, as well as the special rapporteur on the contemporary forms of slavery. And I believe that the Australia is going to evaluate this program, because it's a pilot project, but hopefully this kind of initiatives can be replicated in the region, but also around the world, so that the labor migration becomes more sustainable. And maybe, so this is a recommendation I have, and maybe one message I would like to highlight is even migration may be temporary, the human rights are permanent. And migrant workers must have equal access to justice and the ability to make meaningful choice about their work and their life. And in other words, they must be recognized not just as laborer, but as human beings with full rights and dignity. Thank you.
If you can just take 30 seconds, the Australia, what they're exploring, is it for all sectors or a specific?
I understand so this is one of the criticisms. So it only applies to migrant workers at a certain scheme. Sorry, I don't remember the name of the labor scheme. But so this is one of the criticism. And another criticism is that the undocumented migrant workers cannot use this system. So hopefully this assessment will be taken up after the pilot process. Thank you.
Coming to you, your Just Good Work app looks at knowledge sharing at the pre-departure level. And as we discussed, even when they're at work, there is an element of, I'm very, very curious to know more about it. Can you share a bit more on the impact it has had before workers leave and during their tenure of work as well?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I can share a bit of the impact and maybe some of the challenges as well. So I think one of the, maybe if we stick with when people are in work as one example, we've been running some pilots actually of extending the capability of the app around an AI chatbot to enable voice interaction so people can just talk about their experience, talk about asking questions in the way that they think about their situation. And we've been trialing it in India in some of the brick kiln areas where literacy is more challenging. In a 2-month pilot, there were about 1,500 workers who used the chatbot, just talking to it in voice mainly. And they, of that cohort, 20% identified they were had an indicator of forced labor and were able to get connected to a local organization who could help them immediately get some support with that. And 77 of those were then able to be removed fully from that situation. And that work is ongoing as it carries on. So we want to see that kind of approach. We're trialing it now in the UK and the seasonal work scheme. And so that kind of thing is extending. I think one of the challenges is often getting significant enough collaboration across the sector to see something like consistent information for workers and consistent insight about their experiences that you can see at the level of a sector. We do see it with the seasonal work scheme in the UK. So anyone who comes to the UK on the seasonal work visa uses the Just Good Work app as part of that journey. And it means that everyone can have confidence that all workers are receiving the same information during their recruitment and during their work in the UK. But it's challenging. It's been challenging to find a way to replicate that in other sectors because if the collaboration doesn't exist in the same way that it does through organizations like Stronger Together in the UK, then it can be very challenging. I think grassroots engagement around, so community outreach is something we see as really critical as well. It was a huge factor when the app was launched in Kenya, connecting with people through faith community networks, through student union groups, through other community organizations where workers would have a high level of trust already. Again, we feel like that's a really critical factor that needs to be replicated in more places. And maybe one last thing to note on challenges is measuring, how do you effectively measure the effectiveness of prevention? How can you know effectively if what you're doing to help prevent an issue is having the kind of intended impact? And I guess a lot of what we heard yesterday around the efforts to try and align data and understanding around some of the baselines hopefully can help us move more quickly to being able to effectively understand and measure preventative efforts as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Metin. So, as I mentioned, Shramik Sanjal did do a survey. They're doing a comparative assessment. We have the lead researcher of the survey here, who's surveyed 2,000 workers pre-departure and while in Malaysia to compare the experiences between those who went through ethical recruitment agents and the rest. So Anuj, exactly 5 minutes because we want to have time for Q&As. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So 5 minutes is a lot of time. So just to reiterate what you just said about the temporary migration. So especially migration from Nepal is the permanent form of temporary labor migration because no one goes there and then just spend 2 years of contract and return. It's not like that in Nepal, at least. So Beam earlier mentioned about the pre-departure orientation program, and we had opportunity to survey 2,000 odd aspirants, and then so whatever been discussed about the ethical recruitment pathway, that is actually resonated in our data as well. So around 34% of that respondent preferred use of remittance is savings, which is pretty interesting. And then the other one is education, which is roughly 19.5%. And then the third one is investment. So this is pretty interesting data, which is unheard of until this ethical recruitment thing came into play in this migration business, at least in Nepal. So we ran a survey about that thing, and then we try to scale up in the destination country, so especially Nepal Malaysia corridor, and then we managed to do this pilot with 51 respondents with 3 hypotheses to start with. So one is about cost and debt. Of course, ethical pathway will have lesser cost, recruitment cost, and also lesser debt, similar with safety and rights. And then the other one, rather directional, which came into being after we ran the survey and do the analysis. So it is about satisfaction and protection. So our findings is whatever we discussed yesterday and also today. It is about the ethical recruitment is the way, and then that actually translated in our survey as well. So now we have evidence to actually, go and then pitch this. So ethical pathway workers rarely pay and also rarely borrow, unlike the traditional way. And then also we talked about debt and financial stress. So debt has a felt cost, so which is significantly lower amongst ethical pathway workers versus traditional. So we have this indicator, so I can explain later about the method and stuffs. But so ethical, it is 2.14 versus traditional, it is 3.53, which is significant difference. And also, having said that, ethical pathway, zero cost, employer pay model, and so forth, even in our survey, 1 in 3 who self-reported as ethical pathway migrants, 1 in 3 still pay the fee. So probably to informal channels, which is also echoed in the discussion yesterday and today. And then we mentioned a bit about this free visa, free ticket. So 10,000 rupees cap for as a service charge. And that actually is window for corruption. I mean, the lesser aware the workers are, more vulnerable they are to pay higher recruitment cost. And then one of the victims, let's say, is in the panel in front of you, who paid huge recruitment pay to go to Qatar. And also for ethical recruitment agencies, which are very few in case of Nepal, and then the certification of their ethical practice are not rewarded in Nepal, at least. Although it is recognized elsewhere, but it is not rewarded. So they go through the same way to find the business and then also navigate through the bureaucracy of Nepal. So it's not different in Nepal, but definitely they are making difference. And then interestingly, for Nepal-Malaysia corridor, currently we do not have any MOU. We had one in 2018 after 17 months of hiatus, but that had a sunset clause, and then it expired in 2023. And I'm not aware if that is being discussed at the moment. So we don't have anything at the moment. There are a lot of things.
If you can just add one last point and wrap up on if you can mention 2 parameters of what's considered ethical recruitment, how workers identified. And
we have varieties of definition. Just to start, it is worker don't pay, and then either it is employer or someone else, but worker don't pay. So that is ethical. So just to wrap up, the one last thing. So who pays for recruitment is the corridor's movable variable. that for our research, and the evidence says the outcomes that matter move with it. So I think this is for every one of us to think about ethical recruitment. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We have some questions online which Carmen will share.
Exactly. Thank you. So from the online audience, online participants, there are a couple of questions. The first one being, what is the one thing, it's a good question, but a bit tricky. What is the one thing, for example, policy, practice, reform, that if happened tomorrow would improve recruitment outcomes from migrant workers in the region?
If you can keep the answers to just a minute, 1 minute.
Yeah. I have a very simple answer to that. No worker should be paying for, no matter whether it's a policy outcome or whatever things we have, whatever discussion we have. At the end of the day, the worker shouldn't be paying for their job. Thank you.
Okay, good. The other question is, recruitment fees have shown themselves hard to eliminate. That's why we're having this forum. What approaches are showing, according to you and your experiences or field, the most promised? So something you would like to highlight, I guess, that is actually working for responsible recruitment.
So I think for sure this example of the factory Evergreen that I mentioned, because they were able to communicate both through the Malaysian recruiter and the agencies they were working with in Nepal to work very closely with individuals as early as possible into the start of their recruitment journey. I think that kind of clarity of or consistent communication throughout that pathway, we definitely saw the fees reduce in the recruitment of that cohort that I mentioned. But I think, as everyone has said, there's still a long way to go around some of the more informal or even earlier stage kind of initial costs that somebody might pay in their village or so on. But yeah.
I have a follow-up question that maybe Taisuke and then Quentin. I know MFA is also doing work in Africa. We are seeing like really long-distance recruitment for low-income jobs. We've seen in the scam centers, African workers being recruited as well. If you can speak a bit more about the recruitment environment in many of the African states that are very, very keen to send their citizens abroad. I think we haven't spoken enough about the Africa-Asia, Africa-GCC corridor. If either of you want to think, or William, if you have something to share.
Yeah, sure. So, sorry, I forgot to mention that in our research, we actually interviewed some African victims, including those from South Africa, Zimbabwe, and we keep hearing about victims from Uganda, Ethiopia, and so on. And in terms of recruitment environment, so one of the reflections I'm having over the last 2 days is it because the lack of implementation of employers' pay principles and the ethical recruitment? Is it also contributing to people being deceived into scam trafficking because, it's so fragmented and because I was thinking, okay, there's a legitimate job, but you have to pay recruitment fee. And then there's this pathway in trafficking, but you don't have to pay for the broker, even though we have seen cases that the brokers were involved. And there's actually one court case in Kenya that the victims from, I think the person was trafficked into scam compound in Myanmar. He lodged a complaint to the labor court against the broker, and the broker got reprimanded by the labor court. So, in short, I think also recruiters can help prevent this kind of trafficking by implementing the employer's pay principles and also implementing ethical recruitment practices.
Thank you. William and then Quentin.
Yeah, thanks, Wani, for pointing this out. I think this is a very critical issue for us. We are speaking about this within the Asian region, but we must also recognize that over the years, Asian countries of origin have become a little more adept or aggressive in protecting the rights of their workers. But at the same time, as this has been happening, there seems to be an endless supply of workers, as we see even now African workers kind of being recruited to work in this kind of region. And I think this is because we are not looking critically enough at the way this temporary labor migration programs operate. We have taken it for granted, and even within now the big UN discourse, it seems as if temporary labor migration programs are here to stay and how we can improve them. As long as we have these temporary labor migration programs and a recruitment model built into it, I think we will always have to deal with this seemingly endless supply of workers that goes to a race to the bottom of the barrel. I think we need to be a lot more critical of this model in itself, the temporary labor migration program, and how recruitment fits within that. The other point I think is we don't talk about it enough, but we need to talk about the organizing of workers. And I'm not saying just trade unions. I think trade unions have to do a lot more across corridors, but I'm talking about just the labor movement, which involves civil society, social movements, and trade unions, looking at what's happening in labor and migrant workers and temporary labor migration programs being symptomatic of what is happening in the world of work today in terms of labor. Thank you.
Thank you.
And maybe just to add a couple of other things. When we first started work with the app in Nairobi, we did some work with recruiters who just to sense check the content. And there was information saying that in the Kenyan law, it said you could only charge 1 month's of salary as the cost or fee of recruitment, at least at that moment in time. But all of the recruiters put their hands up and said that can't be what the law says because that's not what any of us do. So there wasn't even a connection with what the law said into actual practice. And then at some point later in the conversation, somebody put their hand up again and said, no, I've just been unchecked and that is what it says. So now what do we do? And so that was one of the areas that we've seen. But I think also the stigma often that is attached with going to the Gulf as a very aspirational destination where a lot of Kenyans are going for work, or Ugandans and so on, means that often when we talk to people in the Gulf, they said friends and family at home won't believe what is happening to us here, the conditions that we've experienced, because they think we just want to keep it for ourselves. And so it's overcoming that as well as a real challenge in that region.
And great discussions. One last point, Beam, if you don't. You're part of the Global Migrant Workers Network, which brings in Asian and African workers. And as William mentioned, civil society has to come together to challenge the rules of temporary labor migration. What kind of knowledge sharing do you have there? You have exactly 30 seconds.
Yeah, actually, thank you, Julium, for raising this. Actually, I, along with many other migrant workers across the Africa and Asia, has come together and to organize the migrant worker in GCC and Malaysia, basically from the low-income sector, including construction, hotel and hospitality, domestic work, agriculture, and we have got about like 27 countries already our member and 20,000 plus member across the world. So it is a great platform for us to kind of collaborate each other, and we have got that network to kind of amplify the work that we are doing, and we are very, very happy to share any kind of references and knowledge sharing. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, William, Quinton, Beam, and Taisuke, and Anuj for your interventions from the floor. And we wrap up the session with this.
Hello. So this is our last session before we take a short break. So I'll welcome Julia to the stage for the next 45 minutes, around 40 minutes, on multinational compliance across jurisdictions. So for the online audience, please stay tuned. with us, and we'll see you in about 40 minutes. Thank you.
Not working. Hi again, everyone. Do we have Anna online? Just no? Okay. So actually, for those online, if you haven't watched the previous session, I would encourage you to do so because William Goyce raised important points that actually relate to this discussion about transnational justice, access to justice for workers, and what is actually available to workers. And Adrian is going to talk a little bit about that as well. So there's been a lot of conversations about data, systems, frameworks, and commitments that we need to have in place to advance responsible recruitment. But in this session, we're going to look at, oh, hi, Anna. Nice to see you.
Hi, Julia. Happy to see you.
In this session, we're going to talk in particular about multinational compliance across jurisdictions. So you've probably all been following legislative developments in the EU, in Germany, in Canada, in Switzerland, in France, in many jurisdictions that are now looking at corporate due diligence legislation. The upcoming EU regulation on forced labor is going to come into force in December 2027, so that's a year and a half away. And companies, suppliers, recruiters are all looking for advice on these compliance requirements, but also there is an increasing risk and possibility of legal liability in courts. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I also want to highlight one case in particular, the Dyson case. I think Anna will touch on that briefly, but it's a very interesting case if you haven't followed, where migrant workers were able to bring the case to English courts, to UK courts. And this is a case about working conditions here in Malaysia, but the case was heard in the UK. So this is one example of many that are emerging on multinational compliance across jurisdictions. IHRB also has a very good short podcast episode with Anna and our colleague Celio on the Dyson case in particular. So if you're curious, go check it out after the session. So we have a wonderful panel that is going to help us dissect the issue from the company perspective, the workers' perspective, but then also from studies that Stronger Together has been undertaking and what is actually happening in practice in terms of implementation, responsibility, and accountability. So, Anna, thank you for joining us. I know it's early in the UK. It's wonderful to have you. So, Anna is the CEO of Human Level. And she's going to talk a little bit more about legal liability and the expectations that are increasing on companies. So, Anna, if we start with the broad picture, how do you see these litigation risks and the new due diligence laws? How is that changing what is expected from companies, from what you're seeing?
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm so sorry I can't join you in person. I have two little twins, and that's why, for me, it's not early. I've been up for a while, but I wish I could be there with you all. Yes, well, there is a huge development here in the laws and the lawsuits when it comes to forced labor. And this is absolutely expecting companies to do a lot more when it comes to forced labor. We are upping the ante, as they say, on forced labor. So what we're seeing is that we have three kinds of laws that many of you will be aware of. The first type of laws are disclosure laws, and that basically is saying, okay, we're not going to tell you what to do about it, but we are asking you to tell the world what you're doing on forced labor, and we would like you to report on these components of forced labour. And those disclosure laws, you've seen them in the UK and in Australia, those disclosure laws copy more or less the components of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. So essentially it'll go through what kind of policies do you have. I was just in the session before we were talking about that. What kind of policies? How do you embed the policy? So things like governance and training and KPIs, things that make that policy real. And then it will go into human rights due diligence and ask companies to report on how it's assessing the risk, how it's engaging with workers, what kinds of actions they're taking, and how they are providing remedy and putting it right. Although I will say that a lot of the disclosure laws don't talk about remedy per se, and they sort of miss that one out, but it is included within action, obviously. So it started with the disclosure laws because it's easier to get political consensus around a disclosure. What we've seen over the last few years is that evolve with the frustration that we know that forced labour is getting worse and not better to teeth-based laws that have more teeth. And so we see due diligence laws, which are telling companies, we do want you to do something about your more severe risks, of which forced labour would be one of those. And in the list I just described on disclosure, it's similar. It would be, you need to be doing that due diligence and showing the world what you're doing. But actually, it's a due diligence duty, so you need to do it. And then you have also import bans that I know a lot of you will be aware of, obviously. But import bans really have a lot of teeth because they stop the goods at the borders when they could be tainted by forced labour. So to round out the question, Julia, the expectations of companies on forced labour are viewed as more complicated than on any other human rights topic because they at the same time are asked to lean in and conduct due diligence and try and tackle the forced labour and do something about it and address it with partners, with others, while at the same time often being subject to a forced labour ban that's telling you, I don't want it. I don't want it in my territory in the US or in Europe or in Canada, and in other jurisdictions too. So what we're saying is that you've got both an obligation of process, of looking at the process, but at the same time an obligation of results that you can't have it. And that's why we're seeing companies really try and grapple between these due diligence laws and the import laws and navigate those with all of the due diligence that they can put in place to prove that they don't have it or they're tackling it, depending on which laws they're subject to.
Thank you, Anna. And to get a little bit more specific, I think there's always a lot of question on whose responsibility this is. So how do you see this at the moment? When we're talking especially about cross-border liability, who is responsible? Is it the brand? Is it the supplier? Is it the recruiter? And if you could just touch on the Dyson case or other cases that are interesting to sort of explore and unpack that a little bit.
Of course, thank you. So I'm formerly a trained lawyer. I practiced law before joining the team at John Ruggie's team at Harvard to work on the UN guiding principles. And when you're a trained lawyer, you are taught, and still today, obviously, that your liability stops at one point based on certain factors. You're taught and you practice law. You say, okay, do I have a liability under the contract? Do I have a liability under the law? Or there are other reasons that I might want to be doing something, but if I don't have liability under the contract or the law, my liability stops. This is different, of course, in the UN guiding principles, where responsibility extends to your value chain. And so to respond to the question, each company in a value chain will have a responsibility for that forced labour happening. What kind of responsibility depends on the situation and what that company is already doing to tackle forced labour. So to put it quite simply, if you have a buyer and then the supplier, the buyer will have responsibility for that forced labour because it's happening in that supply chain and they are linked to that forced labour. But if it turns out that that forced labour has been happening for a while, people will know about it. And the company, the buyer, really doesn't have anything in place on forced labour, or what they have in place is viewed as not sufficient. Really, everyone knows that wouldn't work. A very superficial audit, for instance. Then then that company would likely be viewed as having contributed to that forced labour under the court system and under the UN guiding principles. Of course, it's very fact specific, but what I'm getting at is that if a buyer is connected to forced labour and there's a situation where we should have known and we haven't done a lot about it, then that responsibility is heightened for the buyer, including under the new EU CSDDD. And what that means when you have a heightened responsibility is that you then are on the hook more for that remedy, for putting it right, for working with a supplier to really contribute to that remedy and to prevent it from happening again. However, if you have done what you can and you've really followed what we would view as reasonable and good practice, and that forced labour is still happening, you still need to be thinking about what you can do in supporting the supplier, but you don't have that extra responsibility of contributing to the remedy. That's the difference between what we call contribution and direct linkage, where it's a little bit of a lighter touch responsibility, although it is still there, which is why it's really powerful for companies to demonstrate the due diligence that they're doing and what they have in place, because that helps them also under future litigation show that they're not on the hook for the remedy because they did what they could. When it comes to the supplier, obviously, if it's in their if it's in their own operations or by working with the recruitment agency, then that is squarely in their responsibility as well. It's very close to home and they have more, what we would say, more leverage over the situation and would be expected to really be putting things in place as well, but with support from the buyers as part of that responsibility. The Dyson case, I'll just touch upon very briefly, is fascinating. I'm a huge, I left the law, but I follow it so closely. I think once a lawyer, always a lawyer. And the Dyson court case is fascinating because it's the first time really that we've had a court case against a buyer. So Dyson, very well known brand, especially here in the UK, but against a buyer for forced labour happening in a supplier and not in a subsidiary. We've seen quite a few court cases, what we call parent company responsibility towards workers in subsidiaries. And that makes more sense. There's more connection, legally between a parent company and a subsidiary. But when it comes to a supplier, there's technically no ownership and no legal connection. So this really is a big deal for a lot of observers and practitioners, because it's like, okay, you now have an extra legal responsibility to be looking at forced labour in your supplier. And in this instance, the court judged that it was admissible in the UK and not in Malaysia, which Dyson wanted it to be in Malaysia, but it was in the UK because it's a particularly heinous crime and the victims are particularly vulnerable, and they thought, it needs to be heard. Lots of decisions are made in the UK, so we're all for ruling on it in the UK. And then the UK judge said, and we feel that there's a responsibility here, a duty of care that's very possible. We need to get more into it, but it's very possible towards the workers for the forced labour, in particular because Dyson was told about it in 2019, 3 years before the lawsuit started, and they didn't act on it. And then at one point they had an internal audit and they actually moved away from that supplier a year before the lawsuit. And so the court case is saying, well, you didn't really act on what you knew and you could have done more, but we'll see in trial. And Dyson decided, well, we don't actually want to see in trial. And so they settled the court case before it went to the whole trial.
Thanks, Anna. And, I think, Adrian, this is a perfect segue for you, because what we heard also in the previous panel from William is that the reality of what's available on the ground for workers in terms of reparation, access to justice, remedies, grievance mechanisms is very different. The Dyson case, I think, is still an exception, unfortunately. So very practically, if something goes wrong today for a worker, say Malaysia, what is available to them?
Thanks for allowing me to share some perspectives. So I have good news and bad news. Which one do you want first? Maybe I'll start with the bad news. The good news. So basically, no migrant worker that I've met will have that gung-ho spirit to come and fight the companies. So that means all of you are safe, right? And I'll tell you why. So many come with low literacy levels. They are alone, isolated. very rural area, it's very rare that they will say, let's fight, let's come, join the union. Not happening. So was that good news or bad news? Anyway, whatever. So, but if they have the ecosystem to support them, and they have the backup with different actors, including family safety, technical support, financial support, they will collectively fight for justice. So the cases that NSI handles are 200 workers, 100 workers. Uniting them is quite challenging, but the first step is always to negotiate with the companies. And for me, I really feel a bit shy sitting here on why 30 years later I have to do this lecture. I mean, this shouldn't be happening, right? You have your guidance. The UN has been there for so long. ILO is 100-year-old organization. Can you imagine? Conventions have been there for donkey's years, but still, we have basics are not taken care of. So what happens when a worker has a problem? We try to negotiate. Either they do it with a trade union or with the NGO. It's only when negotiations fail or there's a certain degree of stubbornness, then we go to the labor department or the industrial court. And if still they are stubborn, that's when we look for international or cross-border jurisdiction. So we flex a bit with the WRO, CBP, and the other shareholder engagements outside Malaysia. So Malaysia continues to be the wild, wild west. Proceed at your own risk, but please, if you can set a good standard, because not many of us have the energy to go and take up a court case. Basic unpaid wage can take up minimum 6 months. Basic. The no-brainer donkey type of cases, right, will take 6 months. The longest case would take 2 to 4 years. I have a child trafficking case that is in its 10th year. The justice system doesn't happen, is not helpful. And that's why the legal opinion for Dyson included on both sides, very strangely, opinions from chief justices of Malaysia. And that's how it was strange. We had to convince them that the term forced labor was just newly introduced to the Malaysian law. It has not been tested yet. And historically, from case management, we know it doesn't work. And that's why we were saying, let's push it to the UK. And I think all of this is really preventable, Please get advice from the right people. I read a Big Four report a few years ago. With all the evidence of forced labor, the conclusion was this. I feel so embarrassed to even share this. Because forced labor is not mentioned in the Malaysian law at that time, hence there's no forced labor. And this is before AI, so it's definitely not an AI-generated nonsense. So please get advice from the proper sources. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think another challenge we see is in legislations where forced labor is not a crime or not included. Approaching this from a trafficking perspective, a lot of workers also don't want to be labeled as a trafficking victim, right? And so there is also reluctance to report to, there's huge barriers to accessing work and other opportunities when you are put as a victim of trafficking. So I think that's another issue as well. Let's talk about the UK in particular, Argentina, and Stronger Together works very closely with organizations trying to implement employer pays and responsible recruitment. And you gave examples earlier of tools and frameworks that are available, and also examples of companies actually saying, this is helpful because it helps us ensure consistency of expectations. But in practice, we see there are still huge gaps as we're seeing workers are not able to access that. So in your opinion, what is the biggest gap? What is missing for us to get to a bit closer to implementation?
Well, I think there are a few things, but I'm going to focus on one, looking at the time as well. I think one of the big barriers is actually a legal one, if we look specifically at the UK. And when we focus, well, we've just heard from Anna about all the law that is in place already, everything that is coming into place, and that will all have a big positive expected impact in the UK as well. If we think about the UK Modern Slavery Act, which has been in place for over 10 years now, there is a reference specifically promoting the employer pays principle, which is great. However, in the national law, the employer pays principle is differently defined, or recruitment fees, sorry, are differently defined than in the ILO definition. And that means that visa costs and travel costs for migrant workers to come into the UK are not captured in that definition. And so Stronger Together is providing the secretariat for the Seasonal Worker Scheme Task Force, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative which brings together about 60 organizations from all different parts of the supply chain in UK horticulture, retailers, suppliers, growers, scheme operators, which are labor providers, as well as a whole range of civil society organizations. And they are sort of trying to address some of those matters, because that legal barrier, that difference between the definitions really makes that there are a lot of migrant workers that are coming to the UK to work in the horticultural sector are paying those costs. And if we think about those costs, what does that look like? Well, on average, that is about £1,150, which is approximately $1,500, which is significant. Coming back to that horticultural scheme, if that's all right. Basically, the Brexit, in relation to Brexit, this scheme was set up to provide visas for workers from other countries to come into the UK to support, well, to work in the horticultural sector for a maximum of 6 months per year, due to the experienced labor shortages in the UK in that sector. You know, what are we talking about in terms of scope? Well, there are approximately 45,000 to 55,000 visas per year that are available. And those are given out by government-appointed scheme operators, labor providers. There's 6 of them in total, 5 specifically related to the horticultural sector, and then 1 specific to the poultry production industry. Yeah, the visa is helping out. The task force that was then set up in reaction to that by this large group of entities, and that is in response to addressing any exploitation happening because of the, well, in response to the scheme, really. And what they do is to look at what's possible within the scheme as it is, to reduce and mitigate any risks, and what is possible in terms of making potential changes to the scheme or the rules, regulations, oversight, enforcement in relation to the scheme, and doing that in a joint way. That task force then said, if we want to look at the employer pays principle and actually introducing that ourselves as a going beyond compliance opportunity into the UK horticultural sector, how would we actually do that? And therefore, they said we need a study, and a first of its kind study, to look into the economic side of this. What would that actually mean? Because if you think about the 45,000 to 55,000 visas, and you think about that cost of about $1,500, that's a lot of money in the end of the day. So the UK government, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and the UK, the Seasonal Worker Scheme Task Force came together and jointly commissioned an independent research to assess the feasibility and the potential impacts of the implementation of EPP for seasonal workers. And they considered addressing the risks of workers incurring debt for their migration costs while considering food security and the sector's long-term sustainability as well, because that's a reality. The research modeled the economic impacts and assesses the operational feasibility of different ways that the EPP could potentially be implemented to determine their likely impact on consumers, on retailers, on growers, and on workers. And so it specifically looks at those costs, what would happen in those 6 models, who would have to pay for that, and what impact would that make economically. And of course, it was looked at in terms of the workers. Now, the 6 modeled options were proposed, 9 potential changes to visa and scheme rules, and 6 other general suggestions that stakeholders could act on. On the back of the findings of the feasibility study, which was, it was quite diverse, all those different models and recommendations. This research came out last summer. We then, in the autumn, facilitated as secretariat of the task force several roundtables in which we brought together all the stakeholders to discuss those findings. And that was really interesting, and lots of different views were given. Everybody listened to each other. Everybody engaged really strongly. Ideas were workshopped, but as I say, there were also diverse views. And so it's not that the outcome so far of those roundtables has been that they said, okay, we're going to go with this particular model or with another model. But there have been direct results that the task force has prioritized and has resulted in activities. They will continue to support the voluntary continuous improvement towards the ILO general principles and operational guidelines for fair recruitment by sharing of good practice, including on recommendation, coordinated action to reduce SWS applicant scamming. That's an important one as well. But also, for example, the task force is scoping a model of safeguarding pots and a hardship fund as a direct result of the findings of the report and the roundtables that have taken place. Some very direct actions that have come from that. But I wanted to share this example because we've spoken so much about all the opportunities that there are, but the realities on the ground of how can we enable EPP and make an impact, a positive impact on workers. There are financial implications and there are economic results for all of those stakeholders that we need to take into account. So.
Yeah, you made the point I was going to make, which is there is a cost. That is the bottom line. I think everyone, all the actors in the ecosystem seem to be comfortable with the worker paying, but not sharing those costs among themselves, right? I think that's what the reality shows. I think we're waiting for questions to come online, but I wanted to ask each of you a sort of practical, quick answer question. Anna, for you, you speak to a lot of companies, and I imagine they're feeling very nervous about all these regulatory developments and what is expected of them. What do you say to companies when they are trying to figure out how they should respond to those legal expectations?
Thank you, Julia. I'm sure you've probably discussed already the US proposals, the trade proposals that came out earlier this month. And I have a newsletter that I'm going to go into it. So please do, I'd love to connect with you and please do read it there if you'd like more detail. But this is such a significant development for forced labour legislation. We've already seen Canada really strengthen its law, and we will see other jurisdictions. So the laws are getting much tighter with more scrutiny on them, because this has now become a trade and geopolitical issue that just this month, although it was a long time coming. So for sure, companies will need to really up the ante on what they're doing. What we often, when we're working with companies on this, and I know it's come out through the conversations already, but there's no one solution, there's no silver bullet, but it is like a jigsaw puzzle of different things you put together that really help to advance. And I would touch upon 8 of them briefly. The first one is we need to change the culture internally on forced labor. When I work on the ground, I work with I've been in a lot of different countries working on this, and I work with corporate HQ and with senior executives on these issues, and they are talking about it completely differently. For them, forced labor is really like, oh, I don't want that. We have zero tolerance for that. There's no understanding of how forced labor really happens in these recruitment corridors and the breadth of it, frankly. And it's not about zero tolerance. It's about, well, it is happening, and it's going to get a lot worse with migration and conflict. And so let's lean in and really acknowledge that, and then think through what we do. So that understanding the culture. Of course, second, the worker engagement, engaging with fantastic organizations on the ground doing this work. It's very tempting, again, when I work with HQ, to be thinking, oh, let's commission audit. Audits might have a role to play, but often they don't bring in the forced labor components, and it's very hard to identify. So what I've found is that the engagements and partnerships are really what help companies find out what's happening. Number 3, beware of the use of AI for this. AI has a role. We've seen a fantastic pilot with the World Economic Forum in Thailand on forced labor. Of course, AI can help us elevate, but also, there are huge risks in using AI in terms of blind spots, disempowerment of workers. This is going to be a huge thing, how companies are using AI for a quick fix to identify and then tackle forced labor. So definitely one to watch for. Number 4, very often companies that I work with it's hard internally, I know, but like to equate remedy with reimbursement of recruitment fees only. And that's not only what remedy is. There are other components of remedy that we are missing if we are equating it with recruitment fees, and in particular, how we are looking at ensuring it doesn't happen again and preventing it. So that's my next point about addressing the root cause. Like, why is it happening? How can we lean in and do something about that, rather than trying to tackle this through a one-on-one approach, which won't necessarily work to tackle it. Collective action with peers, we've talked about that a lot, I know, is so critical in this space, because obviously it's not happening only to you and your supply chain, it's happening across a site, across a zone, across a country. So that is absolutely critical. And the last 2 I'll say is, of course, bringing in government. We've talked about that. If governments don't have the laws, the enforcement, if they're not playing their role and their duty under international human rights law, then it is very hard for companies to tackle this. And the last one I'll say is about transparency and being open about the challenges. This is hard, but there are things that we're doing. Here's how we're advancing. Here's what we're learning. Here's how we're progressing. And that transparency raises the bar for others to come in and take that more holistic approach to tackling forced labor.
Thank you so much, Anna. Adrian, looking from the worker perspective, Anna touched on worker engagement and grievances. What would you say to a company who's looking to actually develop a grievance mechanism or worker engagement in a way that actually works and is useful for workers?
One gap that we find is the cultural communications competency. So something as simple as explaining to the worker. Now, I appreciate all the digital tools, but there are many workers who can't read. They can't spell their own name. What more understand an agreement or a collective bargaining agreement or the law. So something as basic as that, you can't ask AI to do that. Come on. Part of my work is looking at your books. With all the 9 digits, 10 digits in your banks, don't tell me you can't hire a translator. I find that mind-boggling, And then you all expect the NGOs to come and translate. We don't mind, we can help. But you guys are the ones making the profits. You should fork it out. I go back to the ecosystem. I think if the ecosystem is supportive, a lot of preventive work can be done. And you safeguard your reputation. You don't lose a lot of sleep. I know how it can feel when you get your letter of demand. But the good news is this, while workers struggle with communications, the quality of evidence has improved significantly. So they have captured, where the recruitment fee goes to in WhatsApp messages, photos. You just pray that one day your face doesn't end up in a WhatsApp group. I've seen my pictures, my team's pictures being circulated in agents, traffickers, sometimes even the government, because we don't have good whistleblower protections. So, but of course, that's good news for us. We get to trace who are the culprits, who are the masterminds, and maybe one day we can get to the root cause. I think a lot of the discussions are still at the surface level. The reality is a lot of organized crime is involved in this. So family members are involved. So a worker will not want to file a case against their own family members. So there are technical dilemmas. Last but not least, I think there was a tool we used called Panjiwa to trace the shipping door to door. So we were actually able to find who were buying furniture that was built using or made using forced labor. So that is good news for us, bad news for you guys. Please eliminate forced labor from your supply chain. It's 2026. There's absolutely no reason it should continue. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. Jantine, going back to the feasibility study, based on what you saw and what you learned, what would you say, both to a company, but also let's think about a labor provider, so a recruiter or a labor agency, if they want to take this seriously and if they want to take responsible recruitment and EPP seriously, what would you say other than look at the tools, do your training? What would you say is the one important thing they need to consider?
One, luckily a lot has been said already by the other panelists. I think collaboration, to keep the conversation and the dialogue across the supply chain going. So between peers, as was said, that's very important, but also across all the supply chain actors, because they all will come from a different perspective. And only when they have those difficult discussions, but then will they come to the solutions that will enable the real impact that we would like to see.
Yes.
Sorry. I forgot one thing. There was one strange incident where in supply chains, the government invests. So we have this provident funds investment, different, about 4 to 5. In one of the cases, my own bishop was a shareholder. And I told him politely, what are you doing with this company, right? But that's not the point. So then when the government has an interest, naturally to pursue justice was very complicated. And that conflict of interest made me understand why. And now if you look at Malaysia, the corruption is so deep. They are flip-flopping policy to policy like they are playing ping pong, and they keep introducing new tools that, I think now there's one controversial tool called Turap. No consultation with the NGOs, we are totally in the dark, but the government wants to push it forward. So supply chains, you have to do the right thing. You have to come together, tell the Malaysian government, enough is enough. It's affecting your business and it will come back to haunt your reputation someday. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, I see we have 13 seconds. First, I want to thank the three of you for joining us. I realize we could have spent a lot more time talking about bans. I think the point you touched on, Anna, is really important and interesting. What is being asked of companies? At the same time, you're asked to disclose, but you're also asked to, you might be limiting your commercial opportunities if you disclose too much. So I think it's an interesting context. and one that certainly we're going to continue working on. But the one thing I would say to all companies is that whether you like the direction of travel or not, this is already happening. And I think ultimately due diligence and knowing your suppliers, knowing your risks, disclosing them, working on them is still the single best thing a company can do to prepare themselves, and acknowledging that there is a cost to doing the right thing, right? Responsible business conduct doesn't come for free. You can't expect workers and communities to pay for that. So thank you very much. And we're going to have a workshop now, but thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're having a break. Yeah, we're eating. I need to eat and have a coffee. But after that, we are having a workshop. So thank you, everyone, and I'll see you in a bit. Exactly at 3:30, please. The workshop is going to be in AI, by the way, and we're going to make sure to really, really entertain you. And for the online audience, you will have your dedicated online session at the same time at 3:30 GMT +8. Thank you for watching.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to everybody here gathered in Kuala Lumpur and to those joining us online for what is the final panel of the 2026 Global Forum for Responsible Recruitment. Thank you for being here. This year's forum has asked how responsible recruitment can hold its ground in an era of global disruption. Labor migration governance is under strain. Regulatory gaps and uneven enforcement are giving informal and opaque recruitment channels room to grow. And while many companies and recruiters have committed to the employer pays principle, implementation remains inconsistent across regions and across sectors. And it's migrant workers who carry the cost of that inconsistency. And it's in this context that this session turns to a dimension of responsible recruitment that deserves far more attention than it usually gets. And that is what the rapid adoption of AI-powered HR technologies mean for migrant workers with disabilities, the risks that it triggers, but also the opportunity that it represents for business leaders working on human rights and sustainability to make disability performance a genuine business imperative. And that's exactly what our panel is here to explore. And it's a panel exceptionally well placed to make it. We have Susan Scott Parker, who is the founder of Business Disability International and the author of a recent IHRB paper on disability rights as a business and human rights imperative, who will be guiding today's conversation. Christopher Patno, who is head of accessibility at Google EMEA, working at the intersection of technology and inclusion, and Victor Garcia Riega, who is responsible business manager at Rathbones Group, who will be bringing the perspective of a practitioner embedding human rights in business practice. Before I hand it over to Susan, I wanted to say that this session is a recorded session that will help frame the in-person workshop that follows. And building on the key challenges and questions that we raise here today, IHRB will facilitate a hands-on discussion on what employers, technology developers, and recruitment agencies need to do to ensure AI and automated hiring tools are deployed responsibly. So as you listen, please take note of what challenges you, what you disagree with, what you'd want to ask, and then you'll have the chance to bring it all into the room. So with that, Susan, the floor is yours.
And thank you for this opportunity. It's fantastic to see the Institute addressing this at such a crucial point in your two-day, very important conference. My job now really is to just provide a bit of context. I wanted to throw out a few stats. We all love some stats, but to give an insight into why this is an emerging priority for so many now operating in the business and human rights domain. And so I want to start by pointing out that this conference of yours perfectly timed because we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, where the UN put down a clear marker saying disabled people must be guaranteed the same fundamental rights as anyone else, including, and this is specifically in the CRPD, protection from exploitation, violence, and abuse, accessibility to the physical and digital environments, and the right to work and participate in public and private life. So what we're doing today is, with the Institute's assistance, is raising awareness of the potential impact where the business and human rights specialists that I know are gathered together in Kuala Lumpur to leverage their collective influence to position disability rights as both an economic and a human rights imperative. I'm just sorry that we can't be with you. We want today to raise awareness of some of the risks to migrant workers, including, but not only those with disabilities, that are triggered by the ever-increasing use by employers, including public sector employers, of automated AI-powered HR systems. And of course, we're also talking about the many individuals, including migrants, who will become disabled in the future. And this is an issue that is particularly relevant to any discussion of migrant workers. We're starting to see some recognition of these issues, I was interested to see, as a Canadian, that even the Harvard Business School has picked up on the hidden worker effect. And they're saying they have found that automated hiring processes are disproportionately prone to filtering out marginalized groups, including, they say, immigrants and migrant workers. So just a few statistics, if you like, to put this in context. The World Health Organization estimates at least, and I stress at least, 16% of the population of any country will have a disability. It's a low estimate. We know 1 in 3 people aged 50 to 64 have a disability. 80% of disabled people live in the global south. And for some reason, another 80% pops up. 80% of disabilities are non-visible. So we'll be talking about people that perhaps you don't regard as having a disability. And that's an issue that I'm hoping you can really address in your conversations later today. But of particular relevance today, all the data shows poverty and disability are strongly interlinked. Poor people are more likely to have disabilities and more likely to acquire disabilities. And disabled people are more likely to become or be poor. The two just go hand in hand, I'm afraid to say. And we know that disabled people are more likely to be vulnerable to exploitation, human traffic, and abuse. The data also shows the higher likelihood of people with disabilities working in dangerous, low-paid, informal jobs. I would suggest, and I know that Sarah's planning to circulate this afterwards, that you check out a recent ILO technical report on the fair recruitment of migrants with disabilities. They're pointing out that in 13 countries, 22% of immigrant workers in agriculture, domestic work, and other mainly low-paid work had experienced at least one occupational health incident, accident, or injury, with 40% having an occupational health problem, which is probably a way of covering the fact that they have disabilities, but doctors are using different terminology. And we have a recent study of migrant workers in Nepal. Between 7 and 11% of returnees cited sickness, injury, or disability as their main reason for coming home. And 22% of Mexican returnees from the US have a disability or impairment. And we also know that 80 to 90% of employers worldwide are using these technologies, and that number is growing every day. And that we have governments also using technologies as they are intervening in what would you call the migrant worker experience journey, as they're trying to move from here to Kuwait. And all the government processes they have to go through are often typically inaccessible. And Chris, maybe you could come in on that later. And so I want to just highlight very quickly some issues that disabled individuals encounter trying to get a job. A college graduate recently told me in Ireland he was told he had to look at the camera when making his video interview, but he's got a visual impairment and he can't find the camera. He's automatically discarded. You need 25 seconds longer for an interview because you stammer, you're discarded. You can't hold the gaming controls because of your disability, you're discarded. Your CV scanner notes that your CV is non-standard because you had a year out because of a spinal cord injury, traffic accident, you're discarded. You score poorly on the Hardview test, which claims to tell the recruiter if you have honor and integrity because they're using facial recognition technology and you have a scarred face. You're discarded. I could go on and on and on, and Victor's smiling at me because he knows I will if you let me, but I'm going to stop. The point is that if you're a migrant worker with a disability, you're up against additional problems that most migrant workers don't experience. You've got doctors intervening who don't realize you could do the job. They just focus on some kind of diagnosis. You've got local regulations that aren't enforced. There's confusion as to whether or not the employers are supposed to make accommodations at what stage of the process, despite what the law might say locally. You've got limited access to health and social services, and so on. I want to finish, though, by making this really important point for all of us, that we've learned that systems that work for extreme users work better for everybody. And so I want to tell a quick story of the Director General then of our UK tax department. And he would stand up on stage and say his job was to persuade every taxpayer in the UK to fill in those forms online. He learned their average reading age was between 9 and 11 years of age. And then he learned that if he made the process accessible and user-friendly for people with visual impairments, color blindness, dyslexia, learning disabilities, hearing loss, ADHD, age-related cognitive decline, limited dexterity, and more, It would inevitably be easier for taxpayers with a reading age of 9. Now, I'm asking you to think, or maybe English as a second or third language, to fill in those forms. And so our aim here is, yes, enabling access to rights for people with disabilities as migrant workers, but it will open doors for so many more. So that's where I wanted to start. So I'm going to turn to Victor, because Victor, you've been in this world of business and human rights for a long time. Where do you see the real opportunities here? Is it realistic that we can mobilize the collective power of people like you in business and human rights work behind this agenda, positioning disability rights as an economic and human rights imperative? What do you think?
Oof, wow, that's a big question, Susan, and I have a very simple answer to that one. I think there is a big opportunity here, but with big opportunity comes big challenges as well. So the opportunities, are endless. Let's say, first of all, if we take into account some of the statistics that you mentioned, there is a big percentage of the population that's got a form of disability, and therefore there is a big market, let's say, for businesses who want to cater in a more inclusive way. But there is also a labor market in there that we might be missing talent from. So I think, and those are very specific examples, and I would say there is an opportunity, definitely. The challenges are also varied. Some of them come from a historical lack of resources for an area such as human rights, for example. I've been working in this area for many years now. And if I think back to 15 years ago, I can see that we have made quite a bit of progress. We have the guiding principles, we have a number of coalitions working on it, we have more companies considering human rights when they are going about their business day. However, there is quite a lot more to do. We still have a long way to go to, for example, running appropriate due diligence on our the agencies that we work with, the ones that help us find talent out there. We still have a way to go in terms of understanding how to make technology truly accessible, not just for our employees, but also for potential suppliers, for example, but also for future talent. We are doing, as a business, as an industry, as a sector, we're doing quite a lot in terms of, for example, supporting social mobility, supporting financial education, etc., etc. But I think there is a lot more that we need to include in those programs to make sure that this is reaching not only people because of a social economic status, but also people who, because they have one or another form of disability, might be at a disadvantage compared to other people. So,
well, and certainly, Victor, I'm going to interrupt you there because we do have some time limitation today. Certainly, my excitement about this conference was that for the first time, a major institution addressing human rights and business is talking about disability. Christopher, where do you see the opportunity in the fact that it's human rights, our audience today, that we're looking at?
I think what we need to remember is that we are not ever defined by one aspect of who we are, whether we're disabled, gay, queer, socioeconomic status, where you come from. We are all, every one of us, these intersectional beings, and these things change over time. I moved from the US into the UK, and I sometimes have no idea what people are talking about because context and culture makes a difference. So it's sometimes, especially in like when people are telling jokes, I have this just inherent disadvantage. So I say this as a lighthearted way, just to show that someone who goes into a different place has a temporary or short-term situational disadvantage. Then you have the stress and the reason people had to leave. This is a human right because it happens to every single one of us. We're not staying at home in our beds waiting because we're afraid of the world. We're in the world trying to make it a better place. We have to take advantage of what we're good at and the goodwill and the expectations of people around us. That's what makes it a human right, because it happens to all of us. Then you overlay the impact of technology, and technology is often designed by people who are thinking about one factor at a time. It is when someone creates a technology, you think, okay, I'm going to, and actually, this reminds me of what you said earlier, when you designed for the extremes. Robert Guerrero, a friend of mine, says if you design for the edges, you get the center for free. And this is just good practice when it comes to designing software and systems and services. Because if you design for the more challenging cases, you're solving the problems for everybody in the center anyway. And when they're having a bad day, or if they've been injured, you're still meeting everyone's needs because you took the effort at the beginning. So one of the challenges that we have is realizing that every single one of us is intersectional. Our lives change, context changes. So what do we do to create an environment that is flexible to meet our needs? And
I'm going to challenge you there. I want to challenge you, Chris, because one of the challenges we have in this conversation about how HR technology is impacting migrant workers is HR, right? The buyers, because they don't position disabled migrants as a priority. They're not interested in removing disability-specific obstacles. They're trying to manage complex systems and using recruitment agencies, the Randstads of this world. So what do we do there?
So the HR...
I want to come in here as well after Christopher. Sorry, Christopher, go ahead.
Well, I'm going to ask Victor if he can change the behavior of his HR people. I'll come back on that. Christopher.
So I think it really has, it's that things roll downhill. So if the organization makes a determination, HR is supposed to follow the expectations of the organization. The recruiting organization is supposed to be following the expectations of the HR team, and the procurement team is just responsible to provide a piece of software that meets the recruiter's needs. But if you can change the organization, everything else rolls downhill. The challenge is that often doesn't happen. So it's up to noble people in each area to try to do their best, but without the cover of leadership saying, this is important, and you have to be out and proud and vocal, and you have to say it more than you want to because people don't listen, then you can have that impact. But the procurement people are just doing what they're told. The HR people are just doing what they're told. We need to change this at the top to make everything else work.
I said to a procurement guy once, if HR asked you to buy submachine guns, you'd probably say, "Are you sure?" Right? They would check it out. Okay, Victor, come in now.
Maybe, unless they're a different type of organization. But what I wanted to add to what Christopher has identified really clearly is that awareness is, it's one of those issues. HR have to deal with quite a lot of demand, and therefore they have very limited resources, usually the same with procurement. So if they are not aware of these issues, they are not necessarily gonna do or take the steps to make sure they are thinking about this actively. So that's where what I see is we've seen a bit of an evolution in terms of a bit consideration of human rights from an HR point of view. We started with gender a little bit, gender balance. We need to have a bit more consideration for women and these. Then we started putting a bit more attention into, sexual orientation, etc. And there was work that was done through HR to make sure that we were, looking after that. And then we became about ethnicity and etc. So we've been making progress, in a way that is being taking one characteristic, another characteristic. And that's been not because of, we decided that was a way of going about it. It's because a number of complex elements came together, societal movement, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, etc. So I think this is the time for us to now keep pushing this messaging about disability and the complexities of disability, the fact that you cannot, it's not like my color of skin, you can see what color skin I am, or if I declare this or that. Disability's got a bit of added complexity when compared to other things. But if we work with our HR teams, if we as human rights professionals, as sustainability professionals, ensure that we put in our plans engagement with HR around this issue, eventually we will get there because they are open to all of this. And at least in my experience with my HR colleagues, when I come to them and I ask a question, they do engage and they looked at ways to finding a solution.
So let's challenge that, because I've heard disability, 20% of the workforce just dismissed as niche, right? Why are we talking about this niche thing? We've got so many other constraints and so on. But if it is a human rights issue, and then you're doing human rights due diligence, do you not hold your HR people to account for whether or not they are in effect enabling rights properly for people with disabilities that they encounter as applicants and colleagues? Is it not part of due diligence to ask them those questions? And if
you would expect so,
and if a disabled person is discriminated against, who in the company is responsible or accountable? Is it the HR director who ordered the tool? Hire view saying I don't have any integrity because I'm facially disfigured? Who goes to jail? Who goes to jail?
Yeah, I think it's one of those questions that again, it's got a bit of a. I'm going to be a bit of a broken record here, but it's quite shared. It's a bit complex because in the first place, it's very difficult to identify a company that's got human rights due diligence nailed down to the teeth. Yeah, Google will do very well in certain areas and not so well in others. We will do relatively well in some areas and others. And if you look across the board, that would be the case. Because let's think about this. It's not just human rights from a HR angle, but you also have to look at a supply angle, but you also have to look at an employee angle, and etc. And human rights is a myriad of the different facets of individuals, as Christopher was talking, that we are. And to be able to cover them all, it is a massive challenge. It is a massive challenge, and we're still working on it. So what I say in this area is liability will be linked to those who are closest to the risk and who are supposed to know. Many people will look at us as good advisors when something needs to be done. So part of our human rights practitioner, part of our sustainability practitioner role is to make sure that we are able to raise some concerns, some issues, and bring people together to work it, and provide expertise in certain areas and look for expertise in other areas where we don't have it. So I think it will depend on a case by case. It would be unfair to point at one person and say, "It's your fault." Of course, there will be cases where that might be the case, but in general, it is more because of the ecosystem, is more because of many different reasons.
Okay, Christopher, comment, please.
I think we have a carrot and stick problem. You say who goes to jail. The problem is nobody goes to jail. So you need a stick. But if you only have a stick, then you're going to go down to the point of lowest common denominator compliance BS. Sorry, it's been a long day. You don't want to have it be just lowest common denominator compliance because that's not going to create the tools that actually make the difference. But if you don't have enough stick and enough carrot, the right answer isn't going to come. What accessibility is really about is providing options for people to meet their own needs, because everyone's needs are going to change over their life or over the day. So what we need to do is to stop thinking about a tick box approach of these things, but take a look at the thoughtful ways that someone has the ability to take an accommodation or a mitigation for some of these HR technologies. You need to have that off-ramp for someone who doesn't fit within the core box. And that's what an HR professional can say. We want to accept and allow this to happen. This part doesn't have to come from the leadership, but it's nice to have the support. Someone has to say, these are the things that we're willing to take an accommodation for. The problem is there's so much fear about fraud that people aren't willing to do that. So how do we handle the problem of fear of fraud and supporting people who have needs. And this is an unsolved problem in every aspect of government, in every country of the world.
Well, fraud when it comes to applying for benefits, but I don't know many job seekers that are prepared to take on the stigma of having a disability just on the off
You would be
chance they can get.
no, you would be so surprised.
I dispute that, and I don't think if we're talking about disabled migrants that they're out there claiming disability status. If anything, the research has shown they're disguising it, right? Because they fear they'll never get a job, or they'll be sent home, or they'll be stuck in, country X for the rest of their lives.
But on the same side, they're the ones that are going to have that have the most need.
Hmm.
So this is why you need to have this transparency of accommodations. So it takes someone to be strong enough to say, I'm willing to take the risk and measure what kind of fraud has actually happened. I've never seen this. That would be a very interesting thing to have someone do, say, we're going to allow these 6 things.
The only time we've seen the evidence is when you've got an outfit like GSK that doesn't require you to prove you have a disability before they treat you properly by being flexible. And they, over 9 years, have seen no fraud. They got rid of a little appeals group they had where they anticipated there would be all this stuff internally. I want to bring us back, because time is short here. I have to bring us back to migrant workers, because what you're describing, Christopher, is that insight that you can't treat people, migrants with disabilities or anyone with a disability, fairly at work if you're not both accessible in the sense of the built environment and the technology accessible to groups of people, and adapting for individuals, because no 2 blind guys are going to need the same arrangement to be productive. And so it's that lack of flexibility that we see with HR technology, where the vendors are out there selling packages and products that claim we're treating everybody properly by treating everyone exactly the same. And so it would be the same as requiring every applicant to go up 3 flights of stairs to an interview room. Most companies now would let a wheelchair using, Stephen Hawking's have his interview on the ground floor. But now, of course, he has to get through the AI stairs because it's all built in as absolutely non-flexible. How can a human rights and business professional in the Kuala Lumpur conference tackle that? Is your role evangelists? Are you teaching the business what disability equality really means in terms of how the company behaves, as well as the impact on the individuals? You're an evangelist, aren't you, Chris?
I am. I'm also an optimist. So you need to have both of these there. I think what would be helpful as a result from this conversation is helping create a taxonomy of what does it actually mean to have support of disabled migrant workers in these kinds of solutions.
Absolutely.
Because then now if we have a taxonomy, if we have a language, we know if we're meeting the expectations of the language. If everybody has different ways of describing things, that's rife for problems, and that's when companies get confused.
Absolutely right.
So please.
And the language is so important, particularly in an environment where you are on a daily basis communicating with people who are not familiar with the issue. So I think you hit the nail in the head there, Christopher, because as you know, part of our evangelist, part of our teaching role is to make sure that people understand what this is about. It's making sure that when we talk about human rights, it doesn't become something that is a bit too theoretical, a bit too removed, a bit too, close to morals and ethics, which is, but doesn't stay there. It goes much, much, much further. And that language, learning, and I think we've mentioned this in previous conversations, is as the way you learn the language of the business to be able to engage with different people at different offices, you also need to help them understand the language of human rights, understand the specific definitions, the specific ways of talking about it. Because, for example, before being a bit more immersed in this area many years ago, when I thought disability, I used to think, wheelchairs, people with speaking impediments, and that's basically mostly it is physical, is the really serious stuff that you see out there. And people get I think a bit, let's say, they're a bit scared of talking about that. And I think we mentioned this in previous conversations as well. Is just, we need to make it something that is not a taboo to discuss. We need to help people understand that there is a range, and therefore we need that flexibility. It's not just about steps. It's also about visuals. It's also about X and Y and Z. So definitely, I think, and to answer shortly your question, Susan, in this area, we have to be everything as sustainability human rights practitioners. We have to be teachers, we have to be evangelists, we have to be mediators, we have to do a bit of diplomatic work, a lot of diplomatic work, because we are, let's be realistic, we are a cost center for our business. We are not revenue generators. They don't necessarily see us most of the time as protecting the business, generating value, or protecting value. They see us as some akin to compliance or regulatory. So we need to make sure that we are those diplomats. We are making people bringing people together, and making sure that things happen.
Absolutely. And I'm conscious that we should be moving towards the bit where we're going to encourage our colleagues at the conference to focus on one or two things. I'm thinking as I listen to you both that actually the carrot for me has always been what happens when people in positions of power in business meet and learn from and with people with disabilities informally as colleagues and expert advisors and fellow entrepreneurs and fellow citizens, right? And so for me, that's part of the carrot and part of the evangelical strategy is to make sure those conversations happen, because that's the only way you challenge the assumption that everyone with a disability is in a wheelchair with a guide dog and a parrot on their shoulder and no speech, right? Like the ultimate stereotypes. And so what would you say if you were now looking at our colleagues in Kuala Lumpur? You're going off to your workshop now. Please talk about this, and maybe if it's short, this you can say, and that. Christopher, what do you think their focus of the discussion could helpfully be?
I really think a lot of this comes to language. I think if we can have a common language of what does it actually mean, and that through that language, we can understand how to represent those expectations. I don't even know where to start as a technologist. This is beyond my space. I work with bits and bytes and nerds. That's my world. I can help you with that. But your world is new to me. So help me understand how to create the tools and opportunities that create the flexibility for these people.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you quickly then as a technologist. If the people in the room that we're talking to have influence in their companies, what do they say to their chief technology officer? What do they say to procurement about the impact of the HR technologies? How can they mitigate risk in that domain in some way? What would you be talking about?
You need to get people involved. You can't let HR handle you can't let AI handle all of the HR decisions. The AI is a tool. It's not a person you can blame because it's just doing what it's being told. We are giving it marching orders. We are the ones that are telling it to do this or not to do that. So if you want to bring in people with disabilities, you need to provide accommodations. That's what you need to say. We need to support these 5 accommodations. I choose 5 because in my case, I have 5 fingers on my hand. And I can only count to 4, so I get 4 plus 1. Give me 5 things that I can do. And then give me permission to do it. And let's do it and measure it and see if we can do more.
And very quickly jump in there. I would say I would look a little bit. I will lift it a little bit in terms of, yes, you need to make sure that people experience, as you mentioned, Susan, that they see what it is like, that they come into contact with this, and etc. Yes, you need to make sure that the technology is accessible and all of that. But I would say, make it an integral part of your approach to human rights. And how you do that is making sure that every time you are looking at these, you present as full a picture as possible. However, also make sure that when you're talking about So what's next, for example? So what I need to do as a company to show that you understand that the challenge is big. So you're going to start one step at a time. Although the human rights, let's say, issues are complex, you need to be able to demonstrate, to show your company that you are not asking them to address all of these issues in year one, but you are going to do it in a way that's creating, exponentially value and is opening doors to address other human rights related issues in this case. And AI is a fantastic tool, at least I've been using it in that way, to, for example, make sure that you know where your risk is the highest, because that's where you should start. Where's the highest risk, plus where you may have the influence to address that risk. So I would say, now that we have AI, you have the opportunity to go through 100 different documents that you probably couldn't do a year ago or 2 years ago because of the energy and time. You can do that, can help you identify where the highest risk for you is and where you have the highest influence, so you can start there.
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan. And so I would just add that if I was in the room, I would be looking at who needs to do and say what differently in my business in the next 2 years, right? You talked about it having to come from the top, that we're treating everyone on an equal basis. What does that really mean for us? And how do we communicate that it's not about inclusion, which is a choice? It's about first treating people fairly on an equal basis. Because you also enhance talent acquisition. How do you get all the carrots and the what was the opposite of carrot? Sticks.
Sticks.
Carrots and sticks.
Or a really big carrot that you can attack people with.
Yeah, I got you. A weaponized carrot. All right, we're weaponizing everything else in the world at the moment. Well, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
As ever, we always find ourselves slightly not quite agreeing. I'm still a little more on the treating people properly isn't really a choice, is it? Anyway, let's come back to that. And Sarah, I think at this point you wanted to come in and take us back, if you like, into the actual workshop now that you're setting out.
Yes, thank you so much. So first I wanted to thank you all for guiding us through this conversation, through really framing this next workshop, bringing up practical, reasonable steps that are available. And really, the key message, I think, is really treating disability rights as a core business and as a human rights responsibility. And what I'd like for us to do now is to take, some of the learnings and the provocations and some of the challenges into the room so that we can continue the conversation with colleagues with us in Kuala Lumpur. But before I do that, I wanted to really thank you all, Susan, Victor, and Chris, for your time today and for this provocation. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. So welcome back to our online audience and everybody in the room. Before I offer a few final reflections, I wanted to welcome Mahendra Pandey online, Director of Forced Labor and Human Trafficking at Humanity United, and also founder of the Global Migrant Workers Network, who will give us a few brief remarks. Thank you, Mahendra, for being here. And we also really want to thank Humanity United for its support in helping make sure that worker voice and civil society have been present at this forum and previous forums. Can you hear us, Mahendra? Hi.
Yes, now I can hear you.
Okay. I was just saying we'll hand it over to you for some brief remarks. Thank you for being here and thank you so much to Humanity United for your support in bringing worker voice and civil society to the Global Forum.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah, and great to be here. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I'm there in my spirit. So as we come to the end of these 2 days of the Global Forum for Responsible Recruitment, I want to begin by thanking ISRB and all the partners who made this forum possible. Bringing businesses, governments, recruiters, civil society, trade union, international organization, and migrant worker leaders into the one space is not easy. And that matters because responsible recruitment cannot be achieved by any one actors alone. Over the past 2 days, we have had the opportunity to exchange ideas, challenges, assumptions, and learn from one another. These conversations are important, but they matters most when they remain connected to the lives of the people they are ultimately meant to serve. As we think about where we go from here, I would like to leave us with one reflection. Responsible recruitment is ultimately about people. That means migrant workers cannot simply just be present in the conversations. They should help shape them. Many gathering about migration happen in conference room. Important conversation happen there. Policies are debated. Research is shared. Recommendations are developed. But migrant worker lives is bigger than policy discussion. Migration is about family. It is about friendship. It is about loneliness, courage, and faith. It is about music, food, culture, storytelling, and the dreams. It is about trying to build a better future for the people we love. I also want to thank you, IHRB, for working with Global Migrant Worker Network to bring migrant workers leaders into this forum. IHRB has built a strong relationship with government, businesses, and other stakeholders, working together to ensure worker leaders are part of these conversations makes the dialogues more meaningful and helps connect policy with lived experience. I hope this spirit of collaborations does not end with this forum. This real work begun tomorrow when organizations return to their office, government continue shaping policy, businesses review their recruitment practice, and the ideas we have discussed here are put into the actions. Building ethical recruitment is ultimately about building an ethical network, one where government, employer, recruiters, civil society, and migrant workers work together, learn from one another, and remain accountable to the shared goal of recruitment with dignity. Thank you, IHRB. Thank you all partners, speaker, participants, and thank you for migrant workers leaders who took the time to hear and share their experience. I hope we live not only with the new ideas and new connections, but with the shared commitment to carrying the collaboration forward in our work every day, every day. Thank you and safe travel. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Mahendra. And I'd like to invite George Muturi, who's here with us all the way from Nairobi, who will join me on stage, who's the head of Secretariat of the Global Migrant Network, Workers Network. And George, if you could come up, thank you.
Jambo. Yeah, in Nairobi, we say jambo and you say jambo sana. So as we end this forum, allow me to greet you with Nairobi, Kenya greetings. Jambo. Jambo tena. Yeah, thank you so much. My name is George Muturi, and I am honored to speak on behalf of the Global Migrant Workers Network, that is GMWN. GMWN is the migrant workers, GMWN is a migrant worker and a survivor-led global network connecting more than 23,000 migrants workers from over 30 countries across Africa, Asia, and Gulf, rooted in life or lived experience, solidarity, hope, and belonging. We work to ensure that migrant workers are not only heard, but are leading the conversations that shape migration policies and recruitment practices. We believe migrant workers should not merely survive, but thrive. It is a privilege to bring an African perspective as we reflect on this 2 days at the Global Forum for Responsible Recruitment. We often say no worker should pay for a job. It is a powerful principle. But let us ask ourselves a difficult questions. If we all agree with this principle, why are the millions of workers still paying their money, their freedom, and sometimes even their lives? However, for many migrant workers across Africa, the reality remains very different. Many leave their communities with dreams of supporting their families and building a better future, only to begin their journeys burdened by recruitment fee, hidden cost, debts, and contract substitution and deception continue to define the migration journey. For many workers, exploitation does not begin at the workplace. It begins moment when they are recruited. I know this reality personally because I went through the same process. I migrated to Gulf with debts. I worked in a construction job in a private school, added in corridors of police station and court, fighting for my own labor case, which I took 1 year and 6 months to aid. And later I shifted to sales job. I spent 18 years working in Gulf. And throughout those years, I also stood beside fellow migrant workers whose stories was like my own. Their experiences taught me that exploitation is not inevitable. It is the result choice made by the system, recruiters, and employers. That is why the responsible recruitment register is important. But let us also be honest and ask ourselves, what is that change we want? What changes lives is implementation, accountability, safeguarding the policies to ensure that the employer pays principle is fully respected by every recruiter, every supplier, every contractor, and every country where they operate. It is a mechanism for transparency and dignity. From Africa perspective, we see the register as an opportunity to change the migration story from one marked by debts and exploitation to one grounded in dignity, fairness, and decent work. It is time to involve African migrants in such forums because it has remained behind for too long. Together, let us build a future where every migrant worker crosses border with hope rather than debt, with dignity rather than fear, and with the confidence that their work is respected and their rights are protected. Because every migrant worker deserves to cross borders with hope, to work with dignity, and to return home with pride. Thank you so much for everyone attended. Let us lift Africa and consider Africa in other future forums. Thank you so much as you travel back to your home place.
Okay, so I'd like to start. So I'll offer just a few final remarks and then everybody's free to go. First, I want to say how grateful we are to every speaker, participant, worker representative, civil society, government representation, and partner who contributed to these 2 days and who allowed us to, make these honest and useful conversations possible. And I'd also like to thank the Walmart Foundation. This forum couldn't have happened without your support. And as Julia said in her opening, at a time when the funding in this field is under very, very enormous pressure, the decision to keep investing in this type of space really matters for us. Thank you as well to all of the contributing organizations and partners in the room and also online who couldn't be here with us today. And I'd also like to thank, of course, Carmen, Rakesh, Julia for everything they did to make the forum possible, for the care, for the time and the energy that they put into this, the months of planning behind the scenes, the problem solving, and also for leading so many of the sessions and workshops. So I'd like to give them all a big round of applause. And then to Sam and Deborah, our communications team, the wider IHRB team, the Just Transitions team who supported us in making climate such a key part of this forum. Of course, Juan and the Insights Pack team there behind. I'd also like to give them a big round of applause. All of the hotel staff who took such good care of us, the cooks, everybody that made us comfortable so that we could have these conversations and focus on the content. And, as Adrian reminded us this morning, we know that it's important to have worker representation in the room and to keep increasing that over the years to come, because that's the reason that we're here at the end of the day. So what I'd like to encourage us to carry forward from this forum is not just the honesty that we've had in the conversations, but also the responsibility to act on everything that we've heard. Because we're not just here to talk and have conversation, we're here because this work needs to move into practice. We're here to have the hard conversations, to also recognize the progress that's been made, but also, as Anna Triponel mentioned earlier, to lean in and really think through the risks, the hard realities that workers are still facing. And we're here to take collective action after we leave the room. So over these 2 days, we heard many things that were encouraging, but we also heard very clearly that the reality for too many migrant workers still hasn't changed enough. The employer pays principle is now part of the expected language of responsible recruitment. We should celebrate this because 10 years ago, it was still contested in many spaces. But we also acknowledge here that language and policy are not the same as reality, and too many workers are still paying recruitment fees. We heard again how, for example, for seafarers, workers can pay up to $10,000 or more for a job at sea. Ben Bailey from Mission to Seafarers reminded us that debt isn't only carried by one person, it's often carried by a whole family, parents, children, siblings. So when a worker pays for a job, it affects a whole household. And that's why we have to keep asking the question again and again, is the worker actually having a fair and fee-free journey into employment and return? We also heard something important about tools. A tool is still just a tool. Guidance matters, contracts matter, standards matters, of course, but none of them work without trust. If we're serious about worker-centered responsible recruitment, then as William Goyce reminded us, trust has to be the starting point. Workers must be able to speak honestly about what's happening to them without fear. Companies, recruiters, and governments have to be willing to hear the uncomfortable parts, not just what confirms progress. And we also need to understand recruitment chains much more clearly. We discussed this yesterday morning during the session on conflict. So who is in your workforce? Who is the employer? Who is the recruitment agent? Who's carrying the cost? Who has responsibility? And under an employer pays model, what's the actual cost of responsible recruitment? Because if those costs aren't surfaced or planned for, then they often get pushed back onto workers, as Julia reminded us earlier today. And this is where collaboration and collective action really matter. Companies can't do this without suppliers and recruiters. Recruiters can't do it without buyers and employers. Governments can't do it without enforcement and practical implementation. And civil society and worker organizations and workers can't keep being brought in after decisions have been made. Evans Kyoko, one of our panelists yesterday, reminded us that the ones closest to the problems are also closest to the solutions. And so I hope we carry that with us. It's true for migrant workers, it's true for seafarers, it's true for communities and corridors that are often discussed from far away, but don't often have the space to shape any of the answers. And so I also want to come back to the theme of resilience, which was the key theme of today, and which is a word we've been hearing in a lot of rooms. Migrant workers are some of the most resilient people we'll ever meet, moving across borders, learning new systems, languages, taking on invisible work, supporting families, and carrying risks that many will never have to carry. But we should be careful not to admire resilience in a way that excuses the systems that keep asking workers to carry so much. So our job is not to celebrate how much workers can endure, but to build systems that ask them to endure less. And this year, for the first time, we also made space in this forum for climate and for disability. We spoke about how climate is already reshaping why people move, where they go, what risks they face, and recruitment can't call itself responsible if some workers are excluded from the start, or if migrant workers are missing from the rooms where climate adaptation and resilience policies are being discussed. And as we look ahead, this was our 9th forum. And for our 10th forum, our intention is to hold it on the African continent. At least that's our hope. Actually, a few questions came in about that earlier, and hopefully in Nairobi. And this forum has looked at many migration corridors over the years, including here in Asia and in other parts of the world, but we've not yet held any of these forums on the African continent. And every year, around 10 to 12 million young Africans enter the labor market, but there's only 3 million formal jobs available. So that's why we really want to have this conversation on the continent, where, you know, that is also very much shaping the future of work and migration. So I hope we leave encouraged, but clear-eyed. Encouraged because we have seen very serious commitment in this room and a lot of good work already happening, but clear-eyed because the real test is not what we've said over the past few days, it's really what changes after we leave. Whether it's companies asking harder questions about their recruitment chains, governments seeing clearly where enforcement and implementation is missing, worker organizations and workers being brought in earlier and being more visible, heard, and protected. So that's where we end. And thank you for being here with us and for the work that many of you are already doing. And we do really look forward to continuing this work in the long run with all of you. So thank you. Yes, and one last thing, we would appreciate if you have 2 minutes just to scan the QR code and leave us some feedback so we can learn what worked, what didn't work, and improve for future forums. So thanks again.